The air on the Anatolian plateau does not simply get hot. It shimmers with a malevolent, dehydrating intensity. It is May 1097. Picture the scene as it unfolds beneath the shadow of the Bithynian Olympus. The ground is hard, cracked, and unforgiving, vibrating rhythmically under the impact of thousands of hooves. The dust rising from the plain of Nicaea is so thick it tastes of copper and dried manure, coating the throats of men who have marched 2,000 miles to die in this foreign dirt. To the south, the skyline is dominated by the formidable walls of Nicaea Ancient, imposing, built by the Romans and now held by the Seljuk Turks. But the terror today does not come from the walls. It comes from the mountains. Descending the slopes like a landslide of steel and fury is the army of Kilij Arslan, the Sultan of Ram. He brings with him a force estimated by breathless chroniclers at 25,000 men, a swarm of horse archers, light cavalry, and battle-hardened veterans who have never known defeat against the Christians. Facing this avalanche is a chaotic, terrified camp of Crusaders. They are split, disorganized, and exhausted. In the vanguard, holding the line, stands a concentrated force of heavy cavalry, the elite of the European nobility. There are barely 800 of them. 800 men encased in iron against 25,000 masters of speed and maneuver. On paper, this is not a battle, it is an execution. The mathematics of war dictate that the Crusaders should be encircled, pinned down by arrows, and slaughtered to a man before the sun reaches its zenith. The Seljuk commanders are already smiling, anticipating the loot, the slaves, and the glory of crushing the Franks just as they had crushed the peasant army a year before. But here is what the chronicles don't tell you in the dry lists of dates and names. They don't capture the sound, the distinct, terrifying metallic thunder of a couched lance charge. They don't explain the psychological shock of seeing an arrow strike a man in the chest, only for that man to keep riding, silent and unstoppable as a gargoyle come to life. On this day, under the walls of Nicaea, the medieval world is about to witness a collision of two incompatible styles of warfare. The outcome will not just decide the fate of the First Crusade. It will shatter the myth of Turkish invincibility and send shockwaves from Constantinople to Baghdad. To understand the sheer insanity of this moment, we must rewind the clock and look at the mind of the man who orchestrated the attack, Kilij Arslan. His name translates to Sword Lion, and in 1097 he was the undisputed predator of Anatolia. He was young, arrogant, and dangerously confident. Just months prior, he had annihilated the People's Crusade, a ragtag mob of peasants led by Peter the Hermit at the Battle of Sivanet. He had butchered them with such ease that he didn't even consider them soldiers. To him, these Europeans were unwashed, undisciplined barbarians who barely knew which end of the spear to hold. So, when scouts reported that another wave of Franks was approaching his capital at Nicaea, Kilij Arslan shrugged. He was so unbothered that he didn't even stay in the city. He left his wife and children behind the walls and marched east to fight his Muslim rivals, the Danishmends, over a petty territorial dispute. He left Nicaea lightly defended, convinced that the city's massive Roman walls and the surrounding lake would hold off any rabble long enough for him to mop them up. This was his first and most fatal mistake. The army marching toward him now was not a mob of peasants with pitchforks. This was the Prince's Crusade. These were men like Bohemond of Taranto, a towering Norman giant who had spent his life fighting the Byzantine Empire. Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, a man of pious lethality, and Raymond of Toulouse, a Cyclopean strategist with the wealth of southern France at his back. These men brought with them the culmination of Western military technology, the knight, and more specifically, the destrier, the massive warhorse bred for shock. But as the Crusaders arrived at Nicaea in early May, they found a city that looked impossible to take. Nicaea was a masterpiece of military engineering, boasting 4 miles of walls, over 100 towers, and a western flank entirely protected by Lake Ascanius. The Crusaders began the siege methodically, but the communication between their different contingents was poor. Bohemond camped on the north side. Godfrey took the east. But the southern gate, the crucial path to the interior of Anatolia, was left dangerously open. It was through this gap that Kilij Arslan intended to strike. News had reached the Sultan that this new enemy was actually laying siege to his capital. Annoyed, but not fearful, he made peace with his Muslim enemies and turned his army back west. He marched with terrifying speed, gathering reinforcements from the mountains. His plan was simple. He would sweep down from the southern hills, smash through the besieging lines, link up with the garrison inside the city, and sandwich the Franks against their own siege works. The Crusaders, however, were not entirely blind. They had captured Turkish spies. In a brutal display of psychological warfare, Bohemond had the spies tortured until they revealed the Sultan's approach. But knowing the enemy is coming and being able to stop them are two very different things. The Crusader army was still fragmented. Raymond of Toulouse, commanding the largest contingent, had not yet arrived at the siege lines. This meant the southern flank was exposed, defended only by a thin screen of skirmishers and the vanguard of the knighthood. The morning of the battle dawned with a deceptive calm. The heat began to rise early, baking the armor of the knights. Inside the Crusader camp, the mood was tense. Men checked their saddle girths, sharpened their swords, and prayed. They knew the Sultan was close. The air felt heavy, charged with the static of impending violence. Then the horizon began to move. From the wooded hills to the south, the Seljuk army emerged. It wasn't a formation. It was a flood. Thousands of horse archers, clad in light robes and lamellar armor, poured onto the plain, their composite bows ready. The sound of their war drums and the shrill ululation of their battle cries echoed off the city walls, where the Turkish garrison cheered them on, sensing salvation. For the average foot soldier in the Crusader camp, this must have looked like the apocalypse. The sky literally darkened as the first volley of Turkish arrows was loosed. The Seljuk tactic was ancient and effective. Swarm the enemy. Unleash a hail of arrows to break their formations. Feign retreat to draw them out, and then encircle and destroy them. They expected the Franks to panic. They expected the heavy horses to stumble. They expected an easy rout. Kilij Arslan watched from the high ground, a smile on his face. He saw the small group of knights forming up near the southern gate. He saw their numbers pathetic compared to his thousands. He gave the order to crush them. The Turkish cavalry spurred their horses forward, a tidal wave of light cavalry crashing toward the Crusader lines. But here is where history pivots on the strength of a stirrup and the temper of steel. The knights did not panic. They did not scatter. Under the command of leaders like Bohemond and Tancred, they did something the Turks had never seen. They tightened their ranks. They locked their knees against their saddles. They lowered their lances' long shafts of ashwood tipped with razor-sharp iron. This was the conroy, the tactical unit of the feudal knight. They stood knee to knee, creating a solid wall of horse and metal. As the Turkish wave crashed in, firing arrows at point-blank range, a strange sound was heard, the clinking of iron on iron. The arrows, which would have pierced through the leather jerkins of a peasant or the light mail of a Byzantine infantryman, were bouncing off the heavy western chainmail. The knights were essentially human tanks. The Turkish arrows, while deadly, lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate the double-linked mail and thick padding worn by the Western elite at this range. The Seljuks watched in horror as men they had shot in the chest simply kept moving, adjusting their grip on their shields, their eyes fixed forward behind the nasal bars of their helmets. Then the order was given. Dieu le veut, God wills it. The signal rippled down the line. The 800 knights spurred their heavy destriers into a gallop. Physics took over. A light Turkish pony, bred for agility and endurance, weighs perhaps 800 pounds. A European destroyer, bred for war, weighs nearly 1,500 pounds, plus the weight of the armored rider. When these two forces collided, the result was catastrophic for the Turks. The Crusaders didn't fence with the enemy. They smashed through them. The impact was visceral. The heavy lances punched through wicker shields and lamellar armor, lifting men out of their saddles and throwing them backward. The sheer weight of the Crusader horses shattered the bones of the lighter Turkish mounts. The iron wall of the Franks plowed a furrow of blood and broken bodies through the center of the Seljuk line. Kilij Arslan, watching from the hills, froze. This was impossible. His men were swarming the knights, slashing with their scimitars, but the reach of the Frankish longswords and the height of their horses gave the Crusaders a terrifying advantage in the melee. The Turks tried to use their mobility to wheel around and shoot, but the knights were pressing so hard so fast that the archers had no room to draw their bows. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical one. The Turks were used to fighting Byzantine mercenaries or Arab rivals. They respected speed and guile. They had no frame of reference for this kind of brute, linear violence. It was like trying to stop a landslide with a fencing foil. The invincibility of the sword lion was evaporating in the dust of the Nicaean plain. However, the battle was not won yet. The numbers were still overwhelmingly against the Crusaders. 800 knights can punch a hole, but they can be swallowed up by 25,000 men. The Seljuks, realizing their arrows were useless against the armor, began to target the horses. Knights toppled as their mounts were shot from under them, crashing into the dust where they were swarmed by Turkish infantry with daggers, seeking the gaps in their visors and armpits. Bohemond held the line with desperate ferocity. He knew that if they broke now, the camp behind them, filled with infantry, priests, and supplies, would be massacred. He sent runners frantically to the other camps. Where is Raymond? Where is Godfrey? The sun was climbing higher, the heat becoming an oven. The knights were exhausting themselves, hacking through wave after wave of fresh Turkish reinforcements. This is the moment of crisis, the tipping point where battles are lost. The Crusaders were encircled. The sheer mass of the Turkish army was beginning to compress the Crusader box. The air was so thick with dust that men fought shadows, striking out at anything that moved. The smell of blood mixed with the sulfur of the hot springs near the lake. Kilij Arslan sensed the momentum shifting back. He ordered his reserves to push for the camp. He could see the prize. He just needed to grind these iron men down for another hour. But the chroniclers tell us that just as the Crusader line began to buckle, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon to the east. It wasn't just dust. It was the glitter of sunlight on thousands of spear tips. Raymond of Toulouse had arrived. And he hadn't just marched. He had force-marched his contingent of Provençal knights and infantry through the night, driving them to the breaking point to reach the battle. The timing was something out of a divine script. Just as the Turks were fully committed to crushing Bohemond's exhausted vanguard, Raymond's force slammed into their exposed flank. The battlefield geometry instantly inverted. The flankers became the flanked. The Seljuks, who had been focused entirely on the heavy knights in front of them, suddenly found a fresh army tearing into their side. And these weren't just more knights. This was a combined arms force of heavy infantry and crossbowmen, a weapon the Turks despised. The crossbow bolts punched through Turkish armor with terrifying ease. The confusion in the Seljuk ranks turned into panic. The communication between Kilij Arslan and his forward commanders broke down. The deafening noise of the battle, the screams, the clash of steel, the roar of the commanders made orders impossible to hear. And then the final blow. Godfrey of Bouillon and Hugh of Vermandois, having secured their sectors of the siege, wheeled their forces around to join the fray. The Seljuk army was now being squeezed from three sides. The easy victory Kilij Arslan had promised his men had turned into a death trap. The morale of the Turkish army, brittle from the shock of the initial nightly charge, shattered. These were soldiers who fought for plunder and prestige. There was no plunder here, only death in the form of unstoppable iron giants. The retreat began as a trickle, a few horsemen turning back toward the mountains, and then, within minutes, it became a rout. Kilij Arslan, staring down at the disaster, made the only choice he could. He abandoned the siege. He abandoned his capital. He abandoned his wife and children inside the walls of Nicaea. He signaled a general retreat. The sword lion turned his horse and fled into the mountains, leaving his army to save themselves. The Crusaders did not pursue them far. Their horses were blown, their men dehydrated. But the carnage on the field was absolute. The ground was littered with thousands of Turkish dead. The Crusaders roamed the battlefield, stripping the bodies of valuable armor and gold, but also engaging in a grisly ritual that would become a hallmark of this brutal war. They severed the heads of the fallen Turks. Why? To send a message. They catapulted these heads over the walls of Nicaea. Imagine being a Turkish defender on the battlements. You have watched your sultan, your invincible leader, ride down to save you. You have watched his army break against the Franks like water on rock. And now, the heads of your comrades are raining down into your streets. The psychological devastation was total. The garrison of Nicaea knew, in that moment, that no help was coming. The victory at Nicaea was not just a tactical win. It was a strategic earthquake. It secured the Crusaders' rear for the rest of the march through Anatolia. It proved that the heavy cavalry charge, when executed with discipline, was the superior weapon of the age. But more importantly, it injected a lethal dose of fear into the Turkish psyche. For the next 100 years, the image of the Frankish knight would haunt the nightmares of the Near East. But as the sun set over the bloody waters of Lake Ascanius, a different kind of reality began to set in. The Crusaders had won, yes, but they had won by the skin of their teeth. They had seen the speed and the numbers of the enemy. They realized that this crusade would not be a glorious parade to Jerusalem. It would be a grinder. And there was a political shadow looming over the victory. The Byzantine emperor Alexios Komnenos, whose empire had been whittled away by these same Turks, was watching. He had provided the boats that finally cut off Nicaea's supply line across the lake. He had provided guides and supplies. And now he wanted his city back. In the days following the battle, as the Crusaders prepared to storm the walls and sack the city, their reward for the blood they had spilled, they woke up to see the Byzantine flag flying from the towers. Alexios had made a secret deal with the Turkish garrison. He had offered them safe conduct if they surrendered to him rather than face the wrath of the Franks. The Crusaders were furious. They had done the bleeding, but the emperor had taken the prize. This betrayal planted a seed of distrust between the Crusaders and the Byzantines that would rot the core of the alliance. It was the first crack in the foundation, a crack that would eventually lead to the ruin of the Crusader states centuries later. But let us return to those 800 knights. In the grand scope of history, numbers often lose their meaning. We read 25,800, and they become abstract statistics. But pause for a moment. Try to inhabit the mind of one of those knights in the vanguard. You are thousands of miles from home. You are encased in stifling heat. You are looking at an army 30 times the size of your own. Every instinct in your reptilian brain is screaming at you to run, to survive, and yet you lower your lance. You kick your heels into the flank of your horse. You ride into the darkness. This battle teaches us something profound about the nature of conviction. The Crusaders were not better soldiers than the Seljuks. They were slower. They were less adaptable to the terrain. They were often starving and sick. But they possessed a singular, terrifying focus. They believed, with absolute certainty, that they were instruments of a divine will. Kilij Arslan lost because he fought a war of calculation. He looked at the odds, he looked at the enemy, and he expected the rational outcome. The Crusaders won because they fought a war of desperation and fanaticism. They broke the logic of the battlefield because they refused to accept it. History is often written by the victors, and the nuances are smoothed over. We forget the fear. We forget the confusion. We forget that on that dusty plain in May 1097, the entire future of the Middle East hung on the discipline of a few hundred men who refused to break formation. It serves as a stark reminder that in war, as in life, the inevitable is only inevitable until someone refuses to yield. The Battle of Nicaea was the opening salvo of a conflict that would reshape the world. It was the moment the West crashed violently back into the East. And while the Crusades are a tapestry of tragedy, religious fervor, and brutality, the charge of those knights remains one of the most militarily significant moments of the medieval era. It proved that technology and tactics could defy the sheer weight of numbers. But it also taught the Crusaders a dangerous lesson, that they were invincible, that God would always intervene. This hubris would carry them to Jerusalem, but it would also lead them into disasters like the Horns of Hattin a century later. They learned that they could defeat the Turks, but they failed to learn that the Turks would adapt, would learn, and would eventually return with a vengeance. The dust has long since settled over Nicaea. The city is now Iznik, a quiet town in modern Turkey. The walls still stand, battered by time and tourists. But if you stand on those ramparts and look south toward the hills, you can almost hear the echo, the thunder of hooves, the clash of civilizations. The moment when the world held its breath and the impossible happened. This is the nature of history. It is not a straight line of progress. It is a series of shocks, of accidents, of gambles taken by men who cannot see the future. We look back and see destiny. They looked forward and saw only death. And yet, they charged. If you want to uncover more lost chapters of history, the battles that define nations and the tactics that changed warfare, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We are peeling back the layers of the past, one battle at a time. Until next time, keep the history alive.